welcome to the podium to Professor Michael Scrivener.
Thank you, Walter. If there might be a chance that you've heard of Edmund Burke, so okay. But then Thelwall might be another story. The advertisement for my talk includes a Gilray cartoon of the image of Edmund Burke peeking in on Richard Price, and I'll be alluding to Richard Price in my talk. But Gilray is an amazing artist. I don't know if you're familiar with him at all, but so I have here a Gilray print of John Thelwall. He's lecturing in 1795 in November, a little before Parliament is to pass what were known by the left-wingers as the Gagging Acts. And they were directed mostly against Thelwall, because Thelwall was this popular lecturer promoting universal manhood suffrage and other reforms. And so the Parliament's reaction in late 1795 was to ban political meetings. And so there's this wonderful image of, maybe we can pass that around. I gave this particular talk to the John Thelwall Society this summer, and I know that I have to, and I want to expand it. So this is truly one of those instances where this is a early stage of a particular project. I will start. Because Thelwall and Burke took such different positions on the French Revolution and British reform politics in the 1790s, one might fail to notice some similarities in their writing. I will be paying attention to surface similarities, as well as similarities that become readable in terms of revolutionary fantasy. First, more obvious similarities. Both were outsiders in relation to the British political elite, the one by nationality, and to some extent by religion, Burke Irish Catholic, the other by social class. Both were ambitious, talented writers and politicians who had deeply meaningful, sometimes ambivalent relationships with men who helped them in their careers, and both emerged as fiercely independent intellectuals not beholden to anyone. Insofar as one can understand the psychological development of writers, it seems that neither was remarkably compliant with or defiant of paternal authority, relating to their father figures or actual fathers, so that their views on kingship and regicide cannot be ascribed to neurotically Oedipal obsessions. Although an ardent counter-revolutionary in his crusade against the French Revolution, Burke also expressed views on India, Ireland, and the American colonies, and minority rights, not unlike those of Thelwall. Before Burke came out against the French Revolution, he was considered the most prominent mainstream liberal in England. I mean, so it was shocking for many people that he was so opposed to the French Revolution. They assumed he would be in favor of it. Viewed in context, both were secular Enlightenment rationalists. Both validated their politics with historic precedents, the ancient constitution for Burke and Saxon democracy for Thelwall. Burke imagined considerable social and moral benefits from an established latitudinarian tolerant Protestantism, and Thelwall assumed that atheism enlarged the sphere of human agency in the tradition of Enlightenment materialism. Both writers cited nature and Enlightenment commonplace as their central philosophical norm, although Thelwall remarked that, so-called, Mr. B's, in his polemic against Burke, he calls it Mr. B, instead of, I mean, here's Burke, a prominent member of Parliament, so it's rather disrespectful, to say the least. Mr. B's nature and mine are widely different. Burkean nature was the organic, intricate, complex, and intergenerational system whose logic conflicted with mechanistic, individualistic Jacobinism. Thelwall's nature, as an antithesis to superstition and irrationality, provided the foundation for his social and political philosophy. Turning now to the unconscious dimensions of the writing, one notices that both read history and politics with an eye to meanings that are decoded and uncovered, as if meanings were unconscious. What presents itself as the literal truth is for both men part of a chain of signification that they will describe with a logic we could call psychoanalytic or associational, rather than syllogistic. What Freud and Lacan were to do much later, Burke and Thelwall, as well as many of their contemporaries, sometimes are already doing. As one recalls Freud's comment that the Romantics discovered the unconscious long before he himself wrote about it. Ronald Paulson, in his representations of revolution, used psychoanalytic concepts to read Revolutionary era visual and literary representations. And John Barrell, in his study of the treason trials of the 1790s, Thelwall was the third person who was tried for treason. He was acquitted, as they all were. John Barrell, in his study of the treason trials of the 1790s, the title of which is Imagining the King's Death, Figurative Treason, Fantasies of Regicide, recognizes the psychoanalytic richness of the ever-present regicide theme in the political and legal discourse about revolution and reform, but leaves these interpretive opportunities unexplored for the most part. Nevertheless, his book emphasizes the ways in which treason and regicide are mental events, products of fantasy and imagination and aesthetic construction. The treason statute of 25 Edwards III defined the crime specifically as imagining and compassing the death of the king, if such imagining were accompanied by overt acts. The legal disputes pivoted on what constituted overt acts and whether acts such as forcefully promoting parliamentary reform might be construed as harming the king, even if circuitously. Proponents of constructive treason interpreted speculatively, reading the underlying motives of the political actors whose literal words and actual deeds fell far short of what could be understood commonly as treasonous. Both the reformers and their opponents practiced a hermeneutics of suspicion, looking for meanings beneath the surface. Additionally, as one reads the political satirical prints of that era, both reform and anti-reform, one sees representations governed by associational logic, wild exaggerations, symbolism, condensation of meanings, puns and wordplay, scatological humor, explicit sexual references, and lurid images of violence. Burke is typically represented in the prints as a regicidal Irish Jesuit, or an absurdly idealistic mad Don Quixote. It is as if the world of politics were a dreamscape rather than a rationalistic parliamentary debating society. In addition to the French Revolution's legal, political, military, and social dimensions, the revolution also provoked desire and anxiety both inside and outside of France. At the center of the psychohistory of the revolution are regicide and tyrannicide, topoi and literary discourse from classical antiquity to Shakespeare and Milton. As fantasy, killing the king connects effectively with patricide. And if we follow Darwin and Freud, phylogenetic memories of the primal horde killing the tyrannical patriarch, the fantasy gives rise to an ambivalent reaction, an ecstatic liberation of desire, and a sensation of freedom from paternal constraint, but also guilt and fear of the patriarch's ghostly, violent return. In Freud's account, the patricidal brothers replace the arbitrary rule of the father with egalitarian law, as they also ritualistically ingest the father and his imaginary power. As divine right absolutism is replaced in theory and in practice by constitutional monarchy in 17th and 18th century Europe, the older residual emotional investments do not disappear in the 19th century or arguably this century. Even contemporary Great Britain cannot entirely forsake a sentimental attachment to monarchy, which is also a tourist attraction, suggesting a widespread nostalgia. A more sinister side of the psychology of idealizing strong leaders is also evident in modernity with its numerous authoritarian rulers and wildly enthusiastic and supinely compliant nations, monarchical or otherwise. The French Revolution produced both messianic, utopian hopes for a paradise on earth and counter-revolutionary panic. The former associated the removal of the phantasmal father with an idealized conception of egalitarian community, and the latter connected the death of the father phantasm with anarchic chaos, the release of repressed and ungovernable desire. Richard Price's sermon celebrating the English Revolution of 1688-89, also known as the Glorious Revolution, and linking it to the French Revolution of 1789, the sermon that is the main text Burke challenges in his reflections on the Revolution in France, waxes poetically and prophetically in depicting the events of 1789 in Paris as harbingers of the Messianic age. When Burke wrote about the same events, he interpreted them with just as much speculative freedom, but treated them as signs of an equally apocalyptic catastrophe, more satanic than messianic. Several years before Louis was actually executed, Burke wrote and spoke as though the violent event was imminent, already a reality, if not yet a fact. For the Revolutionary era, the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity are also desire, regicide, and patricidal brotherhood. Both Price and Burke were reading the unconscious of the Revolution, trying to identify its true nature, its teleological trajectory. In Reflections on the Revolution in France, Burke reads what seem to be minor transgressions in manners, morals, and politics as major transgressions, as we might call them symptoms. This revolutionary illness, as he sees it, has multiple symptoms, from a symbolic transgression like the Reformed Society's improper correspondence with foreign governments, to violations of morality and law like murder and cannibalism. When the Reformed Societies correspond with the French Revolutionary Assembly, they are violating a formal protocol that restricts communications only to official government channels. Thereby, they are already guilty of symbolic regicide. Burke connects Richard Price with the notorious Puritan regicide Hugh Peters, even though Price's sermon contains no explicit justification for regicide. Burke argues for a coherent, complex, multidimensional revolutionary illness with religious, social, cultural, economic, philosophical, and political symptoms. As the French have contracted this disease, the British are in danger of catching the contagion. Burke illustrates what he calls the absurdity of the British Reformed Societies, and Thelwall was closely associated with the main working class one, which was the London Corresponding Society. Burke illustrates what he calls the absurdity of the British Reformed Societies, congratulating the French revolutionary government on its recent emancipation from oppression, with other situations of release from confinement, of a madman and murderer from their cells, and a gang of chained prisoners being liberated by the deluded Don Quixote. In these examples of emotionally agitated rhetoric, Burke dispenses with inductive logic and evidence for symbolic interpretation, reading beneath the surface for what he assumes is the real meaning. Burke, when he wishes, can make strong rational arguments, as when he presents a moderately Whiggish case for the Revolution of 1688-89. By associating Richard Price and the Reformed Societies with madness and quixotic idealism, with delusions and murder, Burke is using a logic of emotional association rather than rational argument, a chain of signification held together by feeling rather than concepts. Thelwall does something similar in the first letter, The Rights of Nature, which he wrote 1795. Rights of Nature, 95-96, where he reads Burke's characterization of the 80,000 British Jacobins, according to Burke, who are utterly incapable of amendment. So this is what Burke is describing as the dangerous people in England. 80,000 British Jacobins utterly incapable of amendment, as an unequivocal threat to him physically, perhaps murder. And Thelwall indeed was attacked at various times physically by soldiers and vigilantes. In Burke's text, 2 letters on a regicide peace, there is no explicit threat against this group other than the recommendation that they be watched closely, and if they undertake a rebellion, that they be subject to legal constraint. Thelwall's interpretation goes beyond what Blake says to describe what the statement means underneath the surface, translated from the apparent meaning to a deeper meaning. For both Burke and Thelwall, symbolic associational interpretation discloses hidden violence and aggression. According to Burke, The Reform Societies and Richard Price use a rhetoric of peace and emancipation, but what the rhetoric conceals is violent madness and murder. Burke claims to have discovered their secret, that they planned to kill the good father. Burke writes admiringly of the talent, spirit, energy, and passion of the British Jacobins, suggesting a degree of self-identification. Indeed, one can account for Burke's passionate hatred of the French and British Jacobins because they remind him of himself, those parts of himself he does not want to accept as his own, those regicidal and quixotic parts identified as Burkean in The Political Prince. So in The Political Prince, he's always, well, almost always represented as a subversive in one way or another, associated with the Jesuits. And in an English Protestant context, that's treasonous. Thelwall ignores signs of Burke's ambivalence and focuses repeatedly on the phrase, utterly incapable of amendment. Already tried for treason in 1794, this is Thelwall, and physically attacked in the 1796 lecture tour in East Anglia, Thelwall construes Burke's phrase as a coded threat of violence. He understands the campaign of repression and intimidation as being orchestrated by Burke, an anti-Jacobin conspiracy. In other words, the phantasmal father is about to kill the sons who are innocent of any aggressive or violent thoughts. Each sees the other side as pursuing an organized attempt to destroy and humiliate. Although Thelwall does not explicitly support regicide and revolutionary violence, he provides an explanatory and exculpatory narrative, which is, if there had been timely and temperate reform in France, rather than domination and oppression, then there would not have been a revolution with its attendant excesses. According to Thelwall, political conflict operates by natural laws of equilibrium, so that society is a self-correcting system with tyranny generating its rebellions and exploitation generating its resistance. This philosophically abstract perspective coexists with an emotionally intense and highly personal response, because the rights of nature, of Thelwall's work, also expresses feelings of rage, anger, humiliation, and anxiety. Thelwall repels the accusation that he and his fellow Democrats are guilty of violence and regicide, in fact or in fantasy. It is Burke and the Pitt government that are planning to exterminate the reformers, and insofar as there has been violence in France and in Saint-Domingue, the moral guilt rests with the oppressors, not the oppressed. Thelwall, in the Sheepshearing Song, he wrote many political songs that were sung by the radicals at protest meetings. Thelwall, in the Sheepshearing Song and in the Chanticleer allegory, which was, very briefly, it's a political allegory where a aristocratic rooster is beheaded. And then it's talked about in obviously political ways. So it's highly approving of killing this aristocratic rooster. Anyway, and several people were put on trial for publishing this. So I'll go back. Thelwall, in the Sheepshearing Song and in the Chanticleer allegory, represented regicidal desire, but mitigated the guilt of such expression in several ways. First, the humor and literariness of the text allowed the playfulness to soften the harshness of the violence. Secondly, the popular form of each text, a song performed multiple times by hundreds of people in pubs and in protest demonstrations, a speech at a debating society, and then printed in a popular periodical, turns individual expression into something collective so that the guilt is shared, thereby diminished. An experience of mental suffering depicted by Richard Price, Edmund Burke, and Thelwall is central for the political vision of each writer. What Price and Thelwall call abjection is a consequence of their oppression by tyrannical authority, associated with monarchy and aristocratic power. In The Rights of Nature, Thelwall writes that if we inherited the spirit of those ancestors over whose honorable graves we stalk, an abject and degraded progeny, end quote, he and his fellow victims of political oppression would not be bullied into silence. A positive identification with an idealized father is overwhelmed by the phantasm of the forbidding father. For Richard Price in his Revolution Society sermon of 1789, When adulation is offered to men in power, quote, it corrupts them by giving them improper ideas of their situation, and it debases those who offer it by manifesting an abjectness founded on improper ideas of themselves. By adulation, Price means idealizing a paternal authority, projecting onto the paternal phantasm attributes that belong properly within the subject who is masochistically disempowering itself. For Burke, in his reflections on the Revolution in France, the moment of anguish is when he imagines the sexual violation of Marie Antoinette. His fantasy of her violation is his masochistic identification with powerless, humiliated men. Humiliation provokes the most rhetorical intensity. Price, who resists offering obedience and affection to unworthy paternal authorities, imagines himself melodramatically abjected, crawling at the feet of a master. This is a quotation. Thelwall's Rights of Nature describes how tyrannical power tries to, quote, ram down our throats with the broad sword ideas that harm the public interest. The image here is of gagging on the power of the father. All three writers find abjection intolerable and an emotional justification for violent retribution. Another parallel between Burke and Thelwall is that each finds in the other a style of articulation that is duplicitous, superficially a symptom of madness, but in fact a deeply disguised strategy of manipulation. Burke's reading of Jacobin conspiracy, according to Thelwall, speculates wildly, madly, with loose analogies explored for moonshine links of unconnected facts. That's a quote. A form of associational rather than rational logic. Although Burke does not name Thelwall as such, the various designations of Jacobin, Democrat, and revolutionary suggest Thelwall strongly enough that he responds to Burke's anti-Jacobin rhetoric in an unambiguously personal way. A figure in the reflections that condenses several dangerous characteristics is Burke's imaginary Jew, a trope for energy, talent, wealth, intelligence, and ambition that is not constrained by emotional loyalty to the fantasized father of traditional aristocratic society. Burke's Jew is also a trope for a ruthless, unsentimental individualism, which is replacing an intricate system of reciprocity and deference. As himself an Irish outsider who strives to be accepted as English and Protestant, Burke especially hated what he so closely resembled. Thelwall, too, sometimes uses the Jew as a figure of oppression, specifically as a Christian trope for the old, outmoded establishment persecuting innocent advocates of the new, better, more socially beneficial ideas. In Rights of Nature, he treats Burke both as a Jew and a Protestant-killing Catholic. Violence in Rights of Nature is always directed at Thelwall and democratic reformers, and the multiple scenarios in which Thelwall imagines that he will be exterminated suggest anxiety fueled by actual physical attacks and judicial proceedings, but also unconscious guilt, which might have been exacerbated as he became increasingly aware of the extent of violence in France, especially the fratricidal violence among the revolutionaries. In other texts, Thelwall is not shy about producing forthright regicidal narratives. In his 1794 trial, the prosecution cited as evidence of treason Thelwall's symbolic decapitation of the foam on the top of his beer glass. He did this at a pub in a political. According to the spy report, quote, Mr. Thelwall took a pot of porter and blowing off the head said, "This is the way I would serve kings." Thelwall and his fellow radicals challenged this report by recalling the word tyrants rather than kings. So, although the Sheepshearing Song and Chanticleer Allegory and other works frame their expressions of violence aesthetically and rhetorically with humor, irony, exaggeration, and so forth, at emotional level, regicide gets played out. The logic of association competes with the legal logic of an aesthetic dispensation by which the violence is not actual but only imagined. In a context where the French king and his family, as well as many thousands of aristocrats and priests, have been executed, Thelwall's symbolic regicide aims to intimidate the enemies of reform and sustain the morale and unity of the reformers. Expressions such as Thelwall's are meaningful as speech acts, not only as aesthetic events with uncertain points of reference to the actual world of experience. To conclude, the revolution for Burke was about king killing and destroying the idealized figure of the father, which provided essential cultural cohesion and authority. As an outsider who struggled for acceptance by an English Protestant society, Burke was especially anxious to repel the negative characterization of himself as a parvenu, leading him to idealize organic traditions and exaggerate the rootlessness of the Democrats, and also obscure his own Irish Catholic roots. His counter-revolutionary panic can be understood also in terms of displacement, as he guiltily imagines the violation and humiliation of aristocratic power. Thelwall's texts, both the regicidal ones and the anti-Jacobin ones, recurrently and ambivalently depict acts of violence. The distinction between tyrannicide and regicide that arose in Thelwall's trial has legal cogency, but emotionally king-killing stirs up guilt and anxiety as well as hope and desire. There's no escaping the ambivalence. Finally, when both of them departed from rationalistic styles of argument, which they did very often, they both expressed truths about themselves and their society. Okay?
There's lots of time for questions.
Yeah,
I'm interested, partly from my own period, 16th century, early 17th century, with the way in which the concept of imagining regicide
right.
drifts from what is probably an original meaning of the word, more like planning.
Yeah.
If you're devising it,
Right.
into something a lot looser.
Yeah.
And in which case, literature is dangerous.
Yeah.
Certainly drama is dangerous. How far into policing imaginative productions in your period does the danger of breaking that law go?
It happens more. It's not systematic. That's the English way. It's not to be systematic and those kind of things. But it does happen. Yeah. So that the Chanticleer allegory was prosecuted, but and also Sheepshearing Song was used as evidence. But there are other writers who would write things even more explicitly regicidal and wouldn't be prosecuted. So it would be, it was the judgment of the government on what, they had limited resources, and so they had to figure out what would be the most effective target to suppress. So Thelwall was a good target because he was so popular. But somebody more obscure, they wouldn't bother.
In the older period, too, there's the notion of les majeste, which is, as I understand it, saying anything derogatory about an idealized monarch. So you can if you intensely disrespect
Yes.
a monarch, that's almost the same thing as planning regicide.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's, Leigh Hunt and his brother would, in 1812, were put in jail for 2 years for being disrespectful of the monarch, and it wasn't even close to being regicidal. It was just being critical of them, and they weren't respectful enough.
So there's kind of sliding scales about how you're going to police this whole foggy area, running from innocent imagining to actually coming up with a regicide plan.
Right. Yeah. Legally, there was a debate about constructive treason. In other words, the idea of overt acts used to mean, you get an army together and try to kill the king. But in the case of the Democratic reformers, they weren't doing that, so they had to construct and say, well, if they're trying to push something against the will of the parliament, which is against the will of the king, this is like it'll lead to eventually killing the king. So it's that sort of thing, called constructive treason.
This sort of psychoanalytic reading style or method that you're talking about, the reading for symptoms, symptomatic reading, is this something that is played out in the larger literary landscape? Is it supported by that, or is there something that's happening?
Are there other texts that sort of do?
A broader
absolutely.
cultural context.
I mean, I'm thinking of Prometheus Unbound by Shelley is all about that. It's all about imagining king, God, father, whatever, that patriarchal thing that is deposed. How do you depose it without bringing about huge amount of guilt and or repetition? In other words, killing king and then another tyrant will replace him and that kind of thing. And so Blake also. Blake's in his various mythological imaginings is trying to imagine ways of overcoming a kind of patriarchal authority without reproducing it. So
I'm thinking more though of the technique of, this is almost like a theory of reading into this that I heard you discussing.
Yeah.
So that's what I was wondering
quite
about,
true.
if there is something that is promoting this sort of reading into.
Yeah. I've written about Thelwall and Burke before, and I'm writing about it differently now. And my earlier writing on it, I was a lot more interested in what actually happened. In other words, what were the historical events and how did the actors relate to them and so on. So I was writing more, the historical aspect of it was much more prominent. And in this case, it's like, I'll let the historians worry about what actually happened, but I'm more interested in the imagining of it and treating the text as vehicles for fantasy, and how are they piecing things together in terms of narrative, trying to make emotional sense of it, and not so concerned about. I mean, I'm aware of it. It's not that I'm not aware of it, but it's not. But I'm more interested in, and if you do that, then you see that Thelwall and Burke have so many similarities. I mean, that's the difference. I mean, if you look at it just historically or politically, one's Jack and one's anti-Jack, they couldn't be more different. But if you look at it more psychoanalytically, then they have all kinds of similarities. So that's.
I almost feel like the Gothic novels of the centuries beforehand trained them to read each other this way.
Oh yeah, the Gothic novels, so rich and that kind of thing. Oh my goodness, yes. That's a golden treasure for psychoanalytic reading. Absolutely. It's about the bad father.
Michel so tells us that the imaginary is part of history. That's the kind of tagline that covers the kind of work you're doing. I think there are a lot of historians right now that are looking to literary texts as historical evidence, seeing the fantasies embedded in them as part of a kind of cultural history that has to be accounted for in other than simply the rational analytic terms of doing political history or constitutional history, or whatever. I think it's an area that really now both literary people and historians are coming at from their own points of view, and they're meeting in the middle. And there are people in my field who are doing that a lot.
Right.
The historian Peter Lake is just finishing a book on Shakespeare's history plays, and looking at the topicality of it in terms of the fantasy material.
Let me ask you to play current cultural critic for a moment. I know something you love to do. If you take Burke in the current imagination, to the extent he's still there, is kind of at least the historical grounding for American conservatism via Russell Kirk and all that sort of stuff. Your reading or your sort of historical take on this both, I think, counters that and also reinforces it at the same time. I mean, it seems to sort of give a broader sort of take. I mean, because what you're saying about Burke's reaction is consistent, in some ways, at least in my mind, with American conservatism today, right? With Is that, I mean, does that jive, I mean, am I
Yeah.
taking?
No, no,
I mean-
I think, well, I mean, my own take on Burke is Burke studies is, one part of it, it goes that way, is the Russell Kirk way, but they're ignoring, I mean, they have to ignore all kinds of stuff.
Right.
So what they're ignoring are, you know, his stuff on Irish Catholicism, minority rights, he's against Indian imperialism, and he was for the American, so on and so forth. So, I mean, or you have to read it in a kind of contorted way. And the way that and then there's a tradition that follows or is in the line with Conor Cruz O'Brien. You know, that Conor Cruz O'Brien reads Burke as, you know, for the most part, a liberal who is, you know, supporting minority rights and so on, and whose reading of the French Revolution is well, I mean, there are various defenses of it. I mean, because that defenses in the sense that, I mean, it was counter-revolutionary panic. On the other hand, I mean, he was right that the symbolic violence led to extraordinary acts of violence, and so forth. So there's a way in which it's the French Revolution that was off center, literally center. So, but, yeah, I mean, in terms of contemporary, there's an interesting article that tries to deal with Burke. It's an article. It's on Burke and Lacan, and it does a comparison. It says, you know, they're both doing pretty much, you know, very, very similar things, similar politics. And maybe Lacan's more conservative than Burke. Yeah. As I was doing this, I mean, I think, I mean, I'm also thinking of American politics, you know, 2016, and how can anyone doubt that politics is not fueled by fantasy and nostalgia? Good heavens.
And dreamscape, as he says.
Oh, dreamscape. Oh, yeah. I mean, stuff that is so factually remote is considered central to their perspective. So. But I don't think there's anything new about that. I think it's an old story. So.